36 years ago, 1978, the blizzard of the century hits the country. I was 6 years old and I remember that winter. It was absolutely amazing. The snow was piling up, the wind was blowing around the corners. Actually, part of the country went black, went dark. The island of Rügen didn't have electricity, didn't have access to anything for days. My father was working in the energy industry already at the time, and he was working day and night and during the weekends over New Year's into January and February of '79. This was probably my first experience of how important energy is and why access to electricity is to our civilization what blood is to our human body. My name is Lars Schernikau, and I recently updated our quite new book, The Unpopular Truth about electricity and the future of energy. I've lived in Europe, in America and in Asia, and I got very passionate about the energy business about 20 years ago when I joined the energy commodity business. Let's take a step back. What are humanity's needs? They probably start with just the simple things, keeping ourselves fed and alive with food and water. I mean, you go thousands of years back. I mean, people were literally spending 70-80% of their time every year to feed themselves and to feed the animals that they in the end used to feed themselves. The second most important thing, I would argue, is probably energy. Even back then, we realized that energy is the core of even the food and water collection, if you want to call it. It's human energy, it's animal energy we used in the past. But then there's a third thing. That third thing is what I call health or even mental health. And especially in modern society has become very, very important. If we were all mentally healthy, I don't think we would have any wars. What is interesting is that over the past decades, a fourth element has come into this equation of humanity's needs. And this is about managing the human pollution or the waste that we create and our lives create. And I think those four things is really everything, in a way, what our life is about. And you realize very quickly that energy is literally in the middle of everything. You also realize very quickly, even though energy economy or the energy industry is only a small fraction, single-digit GDP portion of the global economy, actually, energy is the economy. Without energy, nothing is happening. When you see pictures like this of one of the new solar farms in the UAE, you think like, wow, this is transition. This is the future of energy. This is how, where we are going to go. And you see very low prices being quoted or very low cost of energy being quoted. You see a large environmental positive impact of so-called CO2 emission reductions. And you think this is the future. The book tries to explain why it's not that easy, and why some of those discussions about the so-called transition today are literally misplaced and they're not based in science. My own country, Germany, is probably one of the leaders in the so-called transition. And you can see on the left side of the slide, you can see that Germany has put up so much wind and solar that wind and solar installed capacity is now probably double what we call the peak power demand. The peak power demand is literally the peak power at any given time during the day that has to be met. When people all turn on their lights or charge their cars or when industries work, you need to meet that peak power every second of the day. So Germany has installed a huge wind and solar capacity in order to manage that so-called transition. And on the right side, you can see that wind and solar capacity that they've put up has now managed to roughly replace 1/3 of the electricity generation or the electricity production of the country. However, keep in mind that Germany is a stagnating country. The power consumption is stagnating, is not increasing. Germany is very, very highly developed. Industries are not really expanding anymore. It's changing from an industrial economy more to a service economy. So the global total electricity consumption of the country is not going up. So you can see the efforts it takes to put up, in this case, wind and solar and what I call intermittent sources of electricity, and what actually comes out. What's even more interesting is that when we spoke before about primary energy, you remember, is that Germany's primary energy only comes to 6% from wind and solar, which is roughly the same as globally the world. And it's amazing to see how little all that effort, and it's probably $1 trillion that Germany has invested in the past 20 years, how little it actually has done. Over the years, I've learned a bit more about energy, and I understand that energy is much more than electricity and what comes out of our, plug from the wall. And when we understand the source of where the energy comes from that we use every single day, we see that actually 80% comes from oil, coal, and gas, and oil is the most important. We understand also that energy really is a combination of things. Electricity makes up roughly 40% of that primary energy use. We call that first column primary energy. And the other 60% is heating, our building, our industries, transportation, and of course industrial energy we need to keep our industries moving. But this electricity part is an interesting one. 60% of electricity comes from coal and gas. And what we hear today and read today in the press is, of course, primarily about so-called renewables. And renewables, of course, a combination of things. There is hydro, there's biomass, there's wind and solar. And wind and solar today make up about already 12% of our electricity need. But when you go back to the first column, you see that actually wind and solar today only makes up a little bit more than 5% of the primary energy. And when you look at this, and when I go back to the experience in 1978, 1979, I started to realize, how important it is to understand where energy comes from and where energy goes to. The energy need of civilization has skyrocketed after actually World War II. So the Industrial Revolution, you can see here, gave us access to coal. And then the oil age came, the gas age came, nuclear energy came. And of course, hydro started to develop, and then wind and solar started to develop. But when you go 200 years back, even just 150 years back, you see we all used to be green. We just burned biomass. Europe didn't have many trees left. The US didn't have many trees left. All those trees were gone. This was so-called green biomass energy. And then energy-dense coal came in, energy-dense oil and gas came in, nuclear even more energy-dense, suddenly gave us huge amounts of energy in order to allow industrial and then human progress to today have 8 billion people live much healthier, wealthier, and more secure than anyone lived 100 years ago. Anyone. And of course, the question is, what will happen in the future? And my argument always is, we will need more energy in the future, not less. Because AI, space travel, all those things we want to do, today we have 2 phones, in the future we may have 4 phones, I don't know. But those chips, those computer chips, they will require much, much more energy in the future. So the belief that we will be able to reduce energy demand or energy requirements, I think is misplaced and not based in reality. Today's energy is 80% based on fossil fuels, oil, coal, and gas in that order of importance, and roughly 5-6% based on wind and solar. And you can see beautifully how that so-called transition to so-called renewables, in this case wind and solar, actually has never been a transition. There's only been addition, nothing else. Going back to electricity, this is the global electricity generation for the past 40 years. And you can see how the electricity consumption has more than doubled in those 40 years globally. You can see coal share 36%, gas 23%. So coal and gas together 60%, nuclear another 10%. So 70% comes from coal, gas, and nuclear. You can see that hydro generation has been growing a bit, but really there is only a limited number of rivers you can tap on. And of course, there's also environmental issues with tapping more rivers, as we've seen in India or in China or other areas. Then you can also beautifully see how wind and solar was added in the past 20 years and how that wind and solar was literally an addition. It was never a transition. What's even more interesting probably is when you go to China. This is China just the past 20 years. And you can then see that China didn't double, but China quadrupled the electricity generation. You can see how coal took that majority share. And coal is still the largest share and continues to grow fast in China. You can also see here hydro, how important it is. And you can also see wind and solar, how important it has become. But it is not the so-called transition people talk about. It is addition, only addition. It makes up a certain portion of the growth, but the growth is still not possible without what we call dispatchable sources of electricity. For comparison, Germany's power generation is a fraction of China's, and even the US was surpassed already 10 years ago in terms of, or even longer, in terms of its total electricity consumption. And of course, China is the production house of the world. And where do all our EVs come from? Where do the solar panels come from? Where does all those so-called clean technology come from? The majority of it comes from China. One aspect that the book covers is this energy and raw material requirement in order to provide the electricity or the power systems for our world. And this is just a photo from a silicon smelter in China. And you can see how a silicon ingot comes out of a 1,500 degree hot bath. And that silicon ingot is then upgraded to very high purity on the right side. You can see it, and it's cut into those wafers, which then out of those then basically computer chips and of course solar panels are made. And the purity required for that silicon is so unbelievably high. And when I read this number every time, I think like, how is this possible? How can you have a 99.99999 after the comma of purity? Just imagine what is required to get to that purity. What energy you need to put into it to get all those impurities out of it. How much waste you generate in order to get to that purity. Because there's so much unpure material that you have generated with a lot of power that you cannot use and have to throw away. 80 to 90% of those things that you see on the right are made in China. And we just talked about how China powers itself and its industry. The IEA, one of the leading Western energy agencies, admits that a so-called clean energy system requires more mineral resources than an energy system based on fossil fuels. I mean, did you know that? I didn't know that. Actually, it requires more from nature, to take more from nature, and then to process all this material with energy in order to make a so-called clean system. How can that be clean? I don't know. I don't understand. And I explore these things in the book. So you need high purity quartz, Pratt's carbon, in order to make this polysilicon. And in the end, of course, out comes CO2 in that process itself. That carbon comes largely from coal. There's literally not one single solar panel in the world today that is possible without coal. You see this coal and even pet coke, and then there's, funny enough, hardwood required from things like from the areas like the Amazonas, and you have these little ovens where the hardwood is then made into usable wood chips, which are then thrown into these silicon smelters. You have to first mine and upgrade high purity quartz, which is silicon oxide. You need to have a huge amount of heat and electricity to upgrade and to basically make out of this high purity quartz to make the solar panels that you then may have on your roof, which in the northern world is covered with snow parts of the years. Funny enough, there's more things you need. You need aluminium, you need glass, you need copper, you need steel, you need cement, you need oil, you need gas, you need rare earth, you need 400 chemicals and acids to make solar panels. Whatever we have has a raw material and energy basis. Every product on your table right now, you watching this video, is not possible with any of these products, which are largely based on fossil fuels. So when people talk about the so-called clean transition, I always ask, have you really thought through the entire life cycle and chain and process? And the book tries to explain this. The so-called transition that we are embarking on and the governments are embarking on in the West and also more and more in Global South, we call it, is we will electrify everything. We will use electricity from so-called clean resources. Clean resources is defined as little CO2. That is wind, solar, more nuclear is now luckily taking a bigger discussion in the equation, which I'm very, very much in favor of. Then there's a bit of biomass, and then there's hydro energy. We discussed hydro energy is limited by nature. Hydro energy has other issues with, changing lands and also has a land footprint and also even a greenhouse gas footprint, by the way. Biomass is a big problem, but we're not discussing biomass today. But wind and solar is the biggest problem. Why is it a big problem? Because you have to consider, if you were to replace an existing gas-fired power station with wind and solar, what you require for that. You need, first of all, a lot of solar and wind. And you need a huge amount of overbuild to make up what we call the natural capacity factor, because in Germany, for instance, a solar panel works 10% of the time of the year, on average. We don't know when that 10% is, we just know it doesn't work at night. So you need to overbuild a huge amount, and we'll talk about this a little bit later. Then second, you need to have a short duration energy storage. Batteries people talk about. Short duration energy storage, these are those to have those short fluctuations over a few minutes, seconds, or even hours. But then in order to overcome seasonal issues, winters, longer periods, dark areas, cloudy times, you need long duration storage. And batteries is not sufficient for that. It's not possible to keep enough energy stored in batteries for long durational purpose. Of course, batteries can last or sit there for half a year, and they lose, of course, energy as like your phone. When you have it sit there without doing anything, it will over time lose energy. But the long duration energy storage is probably one of the biggest problems. People talk about hydrogen. But then the fact is that currently, at least in Germany, we're still planning thermal power plant on standby as backup. We're building new gas-fired power stations. And we have currently gas-fired power stations in Germany. In Bavaria, you have power stations that are working 1 or 2 days a year. They're there for backup for really bad times. Because right now there is no long duration energy storage, by the way. On top of that, you need a much more complex and larger transmission grid, smart systems. And now go and look at this list. You have 5 things you're building up to replace one gas or coal-fired power station. Is this sustainable? Think about the raw materials you need for this. Think about the energy you need to build for this. And now make the calculation and think, what is better for nature? I don't know. I'm just questioning the logic of what we're currently doing. Because most, if not all, of the large government reports do not consider any of this. Talking about solar itself, take a sunny day anywhere you live. And the question often arises, how much overbuild do I require? Well, let's have a look. If this is my demand curve over the day, whatever, it goes up and down, during the day, at night, in the evening, it doesn't really matter. The logic is, okay, the sun shines during the day, at night it doesn't shine, so we just have to overbuild 2 times. Okay, that's fine. Seems logical to me. Well, let's take a step further. Actually, the sunniest areas in the world, California, Arizona, Australia, South Africa, they have a so-called natural capacity factor of 25% on average for the year. That means on average, 1 out of 4 hours the sun shines in the best areas in the world. Because there's mornings, there's evenings where the sun doesn't shine much usable. Also, there are days when it's just cloudy, right? So on average it's 25%. Germany is 10% roughly. So you would now suddenly have to overbuild 4 times. And in Germany, I just use 11% now, not 10% capacity factor, you would have to overbuild 9 times. So now, all what I've done, I've basically generated enough electricity during the day to use that electricity at night on average for the year. That's all I've done. For that same day, the same night. Nothing else. There's no spare capacity, there's no 2 days, nothing. Right? So now let's think that we need some storage to first move that electricity from the day to the night. Anything. A battery. And if you assume that that loss, energy loss from the day to the night is maybe 20%. If you were to use hydrogen for long duration energy storage, you will lose up to 80% of the input energy in order to make it. Suddenly, your overbuild becomes 11 to 45 times. Remember, all I have done, I've just now stored electricity from the day to use at night. Nothing else. Now let's take one step further. Let's say I just need 10 days of storage. Nothing else, just 10 days of storage. I now have to overbuild 110 to 440, 550 times to have those 10 days covered. 20 days? 30 days? You start to see the problem that this overbuild issue is becoming so huge and so large. And of course, that is driven by the low energy density and the intermittency of solar. The book, now it's in its newest revision, we updated all numbers and made a lot of adjustments, is called The Unpopular Truth about Electricity and the Future of Energy. And it explains why and how electricity is literally, to modern civilization, what blood is to the human body. So I ask you, what will you and what will I do today without energy? When you go back and you think that this energy density issue, right, the fact that there's only so much energy that comes down on Earth from the sun per square meter, that there's only so much energy we can capture with the wind, has a raw material energy impact. The intermittency issue has a raw material energy impact because of the ancillary systems we have to put up. You have to think that this has, of course, an impact on the environment. There is also a third aspect, which is called the lifetime. So the operational lifetime of a solar panel or a windmill is only a fraction of a gas power plant, nuclear power plant, or coal-fired power station. And all of this together has an impact on our environment. I mean, the installations need to be built. And the raw materials come from Africa, much of them, not all of them. They are shipped to China. They're processed in China with largely coal-fired power and electricity and heat. And then the installations, the EVs or the solar panels or the windmills are shipped to Europe or the US, for use for 15, 20 years. And then it's shipped back to Africa. Once it's done, it's just disposed of. This is a new modern circular economy. This is what's really happening. And I've seen these things. I've seen these dumps in Africa. I've seen the power plants and the smelters in China. And I've seen, of course, and we all of us see every day on the streets, those beautiful so-called clean products. Isn't it time that we take a step back and think about these things and make a truly positive difference? This is what the book discusses. So the question is, what now? What do we do with this? What happens? What's the result? Well, one result is that we're literally starving ourselves of energy, because the energy required to build a so-called clean energy system in a usable way, that means including the ancillary backup storage units, is so big that we actually literally don't have enough energy to build all this. And it's a concept I explain in the book called EROI, Energy Return of Investment, and you can read up on it and try to understand why I'm talking about this. And the energy economic community speaks about this quite a bit. And I don't know if you're aware, but in Germany, energy poverty, households under energy poverty, as per the official government auditor called Bundesrechnungshof, increased from 15 to 25% in 2 years, from 21 to 23. Of course, COVID at the basis, and then plus, of course, the Russian invasion is blamed for that. There's a bit more than those two things. But you think about how quickly and how impactful energy poverty can be. I mean, you look at the photo on the top left, Kinshasa, 17 million tons. Are you going to power Kinshasa with wind and solar? When I hear that Mozambique is given funds from Germany to build electricity grids, but those funds are given with the condition you cannot put Mozambique coal power electricity through that grid. This is the future of the clean system. We are starving ourselves of energy. We are not allowing to use Mozambique coal products that they mine themselves in their country, generate electricity, to transmit electricity to the people in need. That cannot be. The impacts of what we are currently doing, of course, have what I just discussed, this issue about the environmental impact and the energy poverty impact. There's a cost impact. And we often see these kind of, old pictures of old power stations, dark, dirty. Well, that's not today's power stations, right? Today's power stations are clean, right? When you go to the newest Chinese, Japanese, or even the last German power plant, even coal-fired power stations, not only gas, right? Or also nuclear, of course. They are clean. You can eat from the floor. That's how clean they are. And if many of the power stations in the world are not yet clean, then what do we have to do? We have to invest to make them clean. In parallel, we need to have R&D to sustainably long-term wean off fossil fuels. I believe that we cannot forever dig things out of the ground and burn them. That cannot be the long-term future, right? Fusion, fission, geothermal. There's so many things that where the future of energy could come from. But until we have that solution, we better work with what we have and make it more efficient and improve them by investing in it to increase what I call the environmental and economic efficiency. So the book is called The Unpopular Truth, and it's called for that reason, because it's a bit unpopular of what I'm saying, right? The unpopular truth about energy transition is it has a problem. It has a big problem. The problem arises primarily from this wind and solar almost obsession. Yeah? The energy density is too low. The energy raw material impact or requirement is too high. The intermittency has a big problem. And then there is this operational lifetime that these things only last a few years, a decade and a half, maybe 2 decades if you're very lucky, compared to another system that lasts much longer. And because of this issue, you need to have ancillary systems, backup, storage. You need to have large additional transmission infrastructure. All requires energy and raw materials to make them usable, workable. The impact, of course, to society has to do with, environmental issues, disposal issues, energy poverty, and of course the cost to the economy and the people. And the left side explains why wind and solar are actually the most expensive. Always are, always will be. In fact, they will become more expensive the more you have. And the book explains this levelized cost of electricity, LCOE, why it shouldn't be used, why it cannot be used, but it is largely used. What you read in the press is largely based on an energy cost measure called levelized cost of electricity, which is incorrect to be used. So the world just doesn't work the way we think it would. And there's very little that happens in the world without oil, coal, and gas, which does not mean we should not look for more energy denser, for better, more efficient, cleaner ways of feeding our energy system. I'm all for that. But I'm very much against making something that's not great, but working, even worse. This is what the book is all about, and I look very much forward to your comments and to your input.